All right, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? We didn't do a sound check. Everybody fine? All right. All right, my name is Jason Adams. This is DC Tardy.
Hello.
We're going to be talking to you today about Configuration Manager 2012 SP1 infrastructure improvements. Most of what we'll talk about are things that we've expanded on from the original Configuration Manager 2012 offering and expanded based on feedback we received mainly from folks like you into new and better functionality to meet your needs. So the specific things we'll be talking about is, first off, how to upgrade to Configuration Manager 2012. Because of the SQL replication and because of the new model that we're using there, it is a little bit of a different experience specifically around the interoperability. We'll also be talking about site expansion. We'll also talk about migration, which is different because we've expanded it from not just 2007 sites to also being able to migrate from other 2012 SP1 sites. We'll talk about new distribution points and also the more granular hierarchy control and secondary site recovery options that we've added into the product. So let's get started. So you've probably seen these slides before. We do realize that in the modern world, there's all sorts of new devices and new types of models for managing those devices. We're moving from a world in which IT administrators had perfect and total control over legacy desktops and PCs into a governance model with our modern devices. And so we have new challenges that we are looking to provide you with new methods of managing and governing those devices. So you have both the control that you had before as well as the new type of options available to you through a combination of solutions, but those solutions working through one single administrative console. So using Configuration Manager, you have access to manage all these new types of devices and to govern them and provide that functionality to your users that they're asking for and that you definitely want to provide. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the infrastructure piece. All right, so in this section we'll talk about hierarchy expansion, also known as site expansion, and the new upgrade. So hierarchy expansion is definitely something that completes the hierarchy simplification scenario that we wanted to build into Configuration Manager 2012. For those of you who've used the new product, you know that it's very different compared to what we had in Configuration Manager 2007. We have the SQL replication, we have the fewer number of sites. But one of the biggest holes that we had in the offering was that you had no way of growing from a standalone primary into a hierarchy later down the road. And in fact, this led to a recommendation to, just in case, install a CAS or central administrative site, so you would have that flexibility down the road. Now what we want to do, though, is provide you with the ability to install a standalone primary, because we're convinced that for most cases, a standalone primary is all that you need. And we don't want to put you in a position where you need to have that additional administrative overhead of monitoring additional sites. So you can now have the freedom to use that smaller footprint and get the functionality that you need that's right-sized to your environment. So when do we want to have a hierarchy and when do we want to have a standalone primary? I just said that I think in most cases, a standalone primary will work for your organization. Really, it's not until you get into a scale mode above 100,000 clients that you should even be thinking about a hierarchy. There are a few other things. There are always some network and security requirements. There could be a scenario in which data or content needs to be stored in a particular geopolitical area. There's also some issues around network access accounts that have not quite been resolved yet, where you can only have one per primary site. So if you have a lot of complex domains that you need to manage and you need those multiple network access accounts, there may be a scenario in which you have to have a hierarchy. But by and large, nearly every other issue can be worked around, and you can use, for less than 100,000 clients, just one standalone primary. All right, so let's say that you've got your primary site, and you start to hit that scale limit. You've grown. You started with 20,000, you've done some mergers, some acquisitions, you've gained on some additional clients, or you've just expanded, and now you've got more and more systems that need to be managed. So now you've taken your standalone primary. How exactly do you go about expanding that into a hierarchy? What you do is you install a brand new central administration site. And at the time that you install that site, you specify the primary site that you've already had and been using. And what will happen is that new central administrative site will reach down to the primary site below and sync all of the global data and fill in where it would have been had that central site been all along. And now to add on additional users into additional scale units, you would then start deploying additional primary sites. Now, after you expand, there are some things to be aware of. This is a scenario in which you've moved everything that used to be on that standalone primary site, where it was considered the only site, the top-level site, to now put that into a central administration site that never existed before and now has to serve that role. So you will see a spike in traffic for software update management. You also see some issues where you have additional default boot WIMs on that local site that originally existed before. And there will be some oddities with packages that had been created on the original standalone primary. Now, in the global model, all those packages will appear on every single site. You'll be able to see them, interact with them, and manage them. Now, what happens with a package, though, is that it does, quote-unquote, belong to a site with regards to the processing by distribution manager. So because all of those packages were previously created on that standalone primary, any kind of updates or modifications that require a distribution manager to interact with the package will be handled on that primary site. Now, this is standard for anything. If you create, even in a hierarchy, a package on one primary site, and then you go to make a change to it, the actual change will occur on that primary site, but in the new centrally managed world, we're now used to all of that happening on the CAS, because the CAS is where you're creating most of your content. So it may look a little different than what you're expecting, and down the road a few years, people might wonder why it is that all these centrally managed packages are still being run or managed on the first primary site. Now, one thing I do want to call out is that this is not site attached. In fact, they're very different entities. And oftentimes, we get feedback from the field that says, hey, when are we going to get site attach back? Or, hey, site expansion, isn't that site attach? So I want to call out where site attach was used in Configuration Manager 2007 and what we do in Configuration Manager 2012 to enable you to have the exact same functionality, and usually in a way that provides you with greater value. Now, the scenarios that we have here were culled from CSS support engagements. We basically went through our support backlog and pulled out all the different calls and inquiries that had come in with regards to site attach in 2007 and came up with these top 4 areas. There are a couple of other dibble-dabble things out there where people use site attach, but these 4 areas by far were the majority of cases. The first one is they use attach, obviously, to join a site to a hierarchy. And in 2012, the way to join a new site is just to install the new site and point to your CAS. The other was mergers and acquisitions. The scenario being that I have one environment, one 2007 environment. My company merges with another. They have their 2007 environment, and I would merge them in together. And it sounds easy. It sounds nice that you could do that. And in 2007, that was actually a good solution, because in 2007, every single primary site was a pretty little snowflake. It had something unique about it that was different from every other primary site, even within the hierarchy. But that's not the case anymore with 2012. In 2012, every primary site is identical. So there's no point in merging a 2012 primary into another primary. What will happen is it'll just be overwritten by the CAS for all its global data. What we do now is we use migration. So if you have those 2 different environments and you want to bring over the elements from one into the other, you set up a migration job. And I'll be talking about that in just a moment. You set up a migration and you pull over just the things you want and just throw the rest away. Finally, there was this idea of how do I handle a hierarchy change? And we did see in 2007 that folks would use detach and attach, make whatever the hierarchy change was, i.e. change your domain or do whatever, and then attach back in and recreate your hierarchy after the fact. Nowadays, with more simplified hierarchies, it really isn't much of an issue anymore. And you can always redeploy sites. Once again, these sites are the exact same. There's nothing special or unique about them. There's no reason to save them off. Redeploy a new site. The clients will send up their site data and bring everything back up to speed. And the final area where we had a significant number of attach-detach issues with support were when we had a problem with attach. so attach didn't work. So in that case, people would have to attach, detach, object application manager would have all kinds of issues, et cetera, et cetera. That issue is no longer on the table because attach no longer exists. So, but it does call out that even in 2007, there were timing issues and problematic problems that could occur during the attach process. We basically removed that entire pain point away from the product. So moving from expansion and into upgrade, I alluded earlier in the when we first introduced this, that upgrade's a little bit different because of the SQL replication model. So there are some things that are the same, though. All upgrades must start at the top and work their way down. You start with the CAS and move that way. Now, where we start running into our differences begin with the different OSD operating system deployment components that we use in SP1. So you do need to have the Windows ADK, and you have to have specific components installed on specific site systems. Now, in 2007 and 2012 RTM, these components were installed for you during setup and upgrade. In 2012 SP1, though, these do have to be provisioned by the user themselves. Now, there is a prereq check that runs during upgrade that will look at your site roles and call out, hey, you need to have the deployment tools deployed on this provider, and it's not there. You need to take care of that. So don't worry right now about, oh, I need to make sure to write all this down or go check the TechNet documentation. The prereq rule will actually flag that for you. One thing to also be aware of is that it is not possible to assign an SP1 client to an RTM site. So once a client is upgraded, it needs to talk to an RTM site, to an SP1 site. Now it can locate content and things like that, but it cannot actually be assigned to the SP1 site. And one thing to always do, and we've had this guidance for 6-7 years now, always run testdb upgrade against a copy of your database as a pre-check validation before actually running the setup. So let's talk about interoperability. Now, the way that we have SQL replication, the moment that something changes in any kind of a global entity, it will be replicated throughout the hierarchy. Now, there are schema changes and differences to different elements within the site servers. And so if you try to replicate some sort of a brand new object, be it a Mac OS object or something like that, on an SP1 site over to an RTM site, it has no idea what that is or what to do with it. So the way that we have worked around that is to create an interoperability layer. What that means is that so long as your hierarchy is in a mixed mode, that is, if you have SP1 and RTM sites working together, certain objects cannot be created, right? So these brand new objects aren't there. On the flip side, all the objects that were there with RTM are still present and you can work on it. So what it really means is that until you've got the whole hierarchy up and installed to SP1, you can't use the SP1 functionality. So let's walk through it real quick. Once the user upgrades let me take a step back. This is an RTM hierarchy that you see on the screen before you. The moment that we upgrade that central administrative site, interop comes on. And once again, what that means is that you can't create any of the new SP1 functionality. Even after I've upgraded one of the primary sites and I went to that primary site UI, I might even be able to see an object, but if I tried to create it, it would say, hey, you're in interop mode. Until you get up to SP1, all throughout your hierarchy, you cannot create the object. And in fact, it's not going to be until we upgrade all of the primaries that we finally get to a point where all of the functionality is available. Now you can see it, so you can get a feel for what the console looks like and some of the new elements there. You just can't create it until everything is brought up to speed. So just some thoughts about what kind of objects you might not be able to create. We have a list here of all the new deployment types. So that involves the Mac, some of the apps that we have out there, and AppV. Some of the new migration things that we've got set up between a V5 hierarchy, a 2012 SP1 hierarchy, and the AppV virtual environments. And once again, the rule of thumb here is that once the entire hierarchy is brought up to the Service Pack 1, all of these options are available. You can move forward. And one other thing to point out is that if you have a standalone primary, none of this applies, because there is no hierarchy, there is no interop. So once again, if you use that smaller footprint, if you start with the more efficient, less administrative overhead, more process-packed standalone primary, then you won't have to worry about this come upgrade time. All right. Talk a little bit about migration here. So in 2012, the only migration paths available to you were for 2007. And that was a fantastic offering because, as you probably recall, there was no, and still is not, an upgrade path directly from 2007 to 2012. Now what we're offering is the ability to move not just from that 2007 hierarchy, but also from another 2012 Service Pack 1. Let me be very clear here, though, that there is not a migration path from 2012 RTM. It's only from 2012 SP1 to 2012 SP1. And just to kind of compare the differences between them, there's quite a bit of additional objects, additional things that you get in pulling from another 2012 SP1 hierarchy into your hierarchy. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the objects are basically the same. So you get everything that you had with 2007 with a few permutations because of the nature of the changes between 2007 and 2012. In addition, you also get the application migration, the virtual environment migration, as well as saved search migration. Now, there's still data that's not, quote-unquote, migrated, and it's data that, in some regards, doesn't really make sense to migrate. One of them is clients. In this case, what you would use is boundaries to reassign your clients to the new site. And then from there, in addition to the client data itself, once the client is reassigned, it will evaluate the objects that you have and then update the data into your new site system. The other thing is security objects. In many cases, especially in a mergers and acquisition scenario, there could be an entirely different security setup between the two environments. And so it doesn't make sense to try to import and bring in entities and objects that may not even exist between the two databases. So the roles, security scopes, and accounts would have to be recreated in the new environment. So in general, when we talk about eligible DPs for upgrading or for sharing, nearly all of them are available, but there are some caveats to it. In 2007, it was optional for you to have the fully qualified domain name configured. So if you want to enable sharing between 2007 and 2012, you must make sure that the FQDN is there because that is a requirement in 2012. If you're going to be doing an upgrade of the branch distribution point, you need to make sure to remove the client from that branch DP before you do so. And in any case, you must make sure that the operating system of whatever distribution point that you're going to be upgrading meets the requirements for 2012. So that is, if you have an older DP that is using a supported operating system on Config Manager 2007 that's no longer supported for 2012, then you'll need to remediate that either by upgrading the operating system or by not doing a DP upgrade. And then here's a chart that also shows that as well. Okay. So disk space. Now, we got a lot of feedback from customers about the disk space requirement. And unfortunately, it still exists the way it was in 2012. When you want to upgrade a distribution point and also upgrade the content, you do still need to allow or allocate double the space for the that's currently used by the content. That's used for processing of the package into the new package and security additions that we have on those packages. Now, what we have done for Service Pack 1 is we've made the system a little bit more palatable in that now we go ahead and remove the older package, because in the past we would upgrade the package, you'd have the new one which was actually being used, and then you had the source one that basically didn't do anything anymore. So we go ahead and remove that for you now, which means that by the time you're done, in general, you should be back to your original kind of profile for the content that was on that distribution point. Secondary site upgrade. When you look at secondary sites and whether you want to upgrade, you should always consider especially the new replication model, the new features that are available in distribution points, if you feel like you still need to have a secondary site, right? We have a lot of customers that told us in the past that they use secondary sites because of the throttling for content that was available. And if that really was your primary reason for having that secondary site, we now know that with distribution points, you can get throttling, and especially with the new pull DP, you can still get a lot of lower bandwidth connections for content. So remember, though, that secondary sites do allow for concentration for network traffic to avoid some of that upward bandwidth being used. So if that's why you had secondary sites before, this is another reason why you can still have the secondary site. Secondary site can also be used for content fan-out. So it's a feature that you still might want to consider or maintain. So if you decide that you do need a secondary site still, the plan would be to actually deploy a Configuration Manager 2012 secondary site, and then upgrade the DP on the existing secondary site and attach it to the new site that you've created. Okay? So let's move on to some new distribution point types. And one of the most exciting ones that we have is the pull distribution point. It's very much a different model. Oftentimes we get questions about, is this just another BDP? And if you remember from 2007, a BDP was a distribution point that tried to use the client framework for content distribution to basically replicate a DP in a lightweight model. But in this case, it is a full distribution point in and of itself. But it is using that pull content model, not just trying to piggyback on top of client infrastructure. So as you can see here, the way that the pull DP works is in a hub and spoke model. What you do is you have a standard distribution point that will act as the source for content, and then a series of pull distribution points which then pull the content from the distribution point. Now what this does is it removes some of the pressure on the original distribution point for having to allocate and push the content out. On that pull mode, the actual performance of having to reach out and grab and pull down is on the pull DP instead of on the distribution point. So this is one way to remove some of the pressure from the distribution points and to make them a little bit more performant. Another type of DP that we have is the cloud distribution point. And there are a lot of great reasons to use the cloud DP, and really it aligns to the great reasons to take advantage of a lot of cloud services. You don't have to have local hardware. You have the fabulous uptime of having something hosted in Windows Azure. All the automatic patching, what have you, it does remove a lot of overhead. And it also, once again, significantly decreases the deployment time for actually building that DP. You don't have to have a box. You don't have to position a box. You're all set and ready to go. And from the perspective of the way you're building that DP, it basically looks the same whenever you're looking at monitoring and setting up your infrastructure. So when you actually go to set up the cloud DP, the first thing you want to do is to create your Azure subscription and then grab your management certificate. Once you get that certificate, you can then go into the console and create or provision the Cloud DP servers and provide your certificate. At which point, we'll reach out and actually provision the blob storage and web role services. And then you can start deploying content to that Cloud DP. So it's a fairly straightforward, quick process. And once you have that Cloud DP, once you put content on there, the way that it works from the client's perspective is that if there's content available on the Cloud DP, but the client does not fall within the boundaries to access any other content, then it can fall all the way back out and then use that Cloud DP. So when you're building your boundary strategy, and when you're thinking about when do I want a client to use the Cloud DP as opposed to a regular DP, you can basically make it so that it is the location of last resort. At that point, the client will request the content, download the content, and move from there. Now I'll turn things over to my partner, DC Tardy, to talk a little bit about hierarchy improvements.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate the time that you guys are spending here with us today. I am happy to be here to talk to you about some hierarchy improvements in regard to specifically replication pieces here. That's what I'm going to be talking about. And we listened to you, our customers, when we built SP1. I hope you're getting the vision of that, especially with the addition of hierarchy expansion and some of the things that you've seen here that Jason just described earlier, and some of the migration pieces, additionally giving you that ability to move data from side to side on a 2012, so you can have kind of like a test environment and a production environment and move some of your data side to side that way. What you're going to see are improvements from a CAS-related perspective in replication links, replication properties, and a lot of added features to help you manage that in a much easier fashion. Now, I know now that we've got hierarchy expansion, a lot of this is we're now pushing the fact that really go with that single standalone primary. And I don't want you to take away a different message when I say all the improvements that we've made with the replication improvements. But when you need the central administration side, we've given you a lot of those replication improvements. So just wanted to underscore those things for you. So we'll talk first about a lot of the replication link improvements, some traffic reporting, a link analyzer, replication link analyzer, and secondary site recovery. You're kind of getting the feel for this particular breakout session that it's very eclectic, and it is. And we're shooting a lot of information at you. I've got for you some demonstrations that I'll bring up just to kind of give you a clue for what to look for when you see some of the replication link improvements. So it doesn't look so much like a black box for you. So let's look at replication link and database configuration improvements. And several of the things that we added, we need to underscore here for the specific replication traffic compression. A lot of people ask me, is it compression on disk? And the answer here is no. This is the actual compression across the network when replication actually happens. And it's helping you out from a bandwidth and a latency perspective, not from on-disk storage. So what you see here is we have decided to default this particular compression to on so that you get that benefit, even though it takes a little bit less than 10% in general of your CPU time on the SQL server, you gain a whole lot of compression over the network. We've also given you the ability not to have to talk to your SQL DBAs. You can actually change the SQL Server Service Broker port from within the administrative console now. And that gives you, when you have those scenarios, you can configure them separately across different links, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Additionally, configuring replication retention threshold. Does everybody... I can't really, well, I can if I do this. Who knows what replication retention is at all? Wow, nobody. Okay, so let me give you the short answer to this. What we do to replicate things from a primary site up to a central administration site is we record the changes that occur on those primary sites or at the central administration site if we need to replicate things down. The retention period says how long do we keep that data around in the database in case a link goes down. By default, we set the retention of that change tracking for 5 days. And the retention period here, we don't want to go farther than 14 days, so we've maxed it out there. But typically, For most of the customers, the reason the default is there is it might be 5 days on a long weekend for some customers to realize that a link is down between a primary and a central administration site. And therefore, we retain the changed data at either the central administration site or the primary. And once the link comes back up, then we just send the changed information, the deltas, across for replication purposes. However, we realize that there are some links that may, even in scenarios where we might be putting up new networks, or you might have some construction going on that'll bring a network down for a lengthier amount of time, and you can up the replication threshold, the retention threshold for those purposes. The converse is if you pass that threshold period, you have to do a whole reinitialization of your database, and therefore the entire footprint of your database gets re-replicated across the network. And that's the reason for the retention threshold. I hope that, it's a little bit complicated, but I hope that's a little bit clearer than before. But I want to go ahead and give you a quick demonstration of what it looks like in the console. And let me log in here. Okay, so before we get into the actual replication link pieces, I want to point out a small change in SP1. We want it to be very consistent with our replication processes, or our replication nomenclature more specifically. And before, you've heard this thing called addresses. Everybody's used to that. In 2007, we've simply renamed it. That's really all we did. And we didn't change the behavior of it. We didn't change the features of it or anything. We just renamed it to file replication. So if you see this thing pop up and you say, what in the world is that? It's just renaming addresses. Okay, so I don't want anybody to be confused there. But let's go ahead and look at our database. Let's go ahead and look at our database replication node. And under the administration wonderbar here, we've got, I've only got a primary site and a CAS. And so it's just going to, for demo purposes, you're just going to have the links, well, not demo purposes, for demo purposes, I only have one link so I can get it on the laptop. But in the administration link, you're just going to have the links listed out here, and you have essentially these three options available for you: to change the link property itself, or to change a parent. In all cases, it would be the central administration site link, or if it's not in all cases, if it's a secondary to a primary site, then you'd have that parent, but then also the child database properties. But let's go into the link properties here, as we've just described for our purposes. And I clicked on it. It's going to take just a second. Right click also works, so whether you right click on it or you left click, you use the wonderbar. We'll go ahead and just show you here real quickly. I'll talk about the rest of these in just a minute, but here's the replication. Let me see. I called up the link properties, and we were talking mainly about database properties just now, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself. And I'm just going to pull up the parent database property. So in this case, you'll see it's for the CAS. And from a CAS perspective, here's where you change the SQL Server Service Broker port. Here's where you enable database compression. As I said, it's defaulted. So it's very simplified for you, so that you don't have to have a whole lot of changes and run a whole bunch of SQL queries and transactions and so forth. You just do it here. And then finally, the same thing, data retention period. Very simplified for you. You just put the numbers in here in this dialog, and you're off and running. And you do that on a per database side. So it's very granular to be able to make these changes to match your security requirements, your link requirements, and so on and so forth, to be able to make these changes as appropriate. So let's hop back to the next one. I'm going to be going back and forth so you can kind of see these after I explain them. So when we go to the information about replication, we have two added opportunities for replication improvements. And this is to help the load on your network, the load on your SQL servers, and so forth. Now, I'm going to ask the new question, because this does get a little complicated. Who knows what distributed views are? Okay, I see one back there. I see my colleague. All right, so one person knows. All right, so for distributed views, this is a concept created by SQL product group, SQL Server, and we're leveraging that. Now, who here would like to turn off replication in certain cases? And yeah, I see a hand here. You may not know that you can or want to, and some of you may not need to because you have a standalone primary site. But specifically, what distributed views does is for certain types of content, you can turn off database replication so that your database is not spinning around sending data across their networks. The good news is, from a reporting view, from a configuration manager view, all of our standard queries and stored procedures, everything looks the same because you essentially link your servers together using SQL Server features, and it looks like all the data sits in a single database when you run your queries. So what that means is, if you use distributed views, you really need well-connected central administration site and primary site database servers. If you have flaky connections and so forth, while you may have some errors show up and data might not come up in your reports, if the connection between your two database servers are down, then that's what will happen. However, if you've got those well-connected database servers for your primary and your central administration site, distributed views helps reduce, obviously, the replication traffic, the CPU to replicate it, and also the database sizes that you don't have to duplicate the data. Now, what's actually available for you to do this with? It's site data alone. The global data is global data, and we're going to always replicate that, not give you the option to turn that on or off or schedule it or anything like that. But we're going to give you the ability to do this for hardware inventory, software inventory, and status messages for that case. The reason we do this for those particular pieces of site data is those are large chunks of data that would have to be replicated and stored in your database servers. So that's the reason for that. So good point I needed to point out here. Because of special consideration for security purposes, what we have is a potential for these linked servers. I know we're getting really complicated here, but for the linked servers where it looks like the central administration site server is one server with the primary sites, it's looking like they are one server. And when we make calls to that database server and then have to go down to the primary site database servers, that's called a double hop authentication. And we're only allowing one, when you turn on distributed views, we're only allowing one provider for you to be able to execute distributed views, and that's the provider at the central administration site. So there is a limitation here, and therefore a single SRS at the CAS is also a requirement there, so we don't have this double hop authentication, and that's for security reasons. So again, I want to make sure that you understand it's very simple to do. So you do the link database distributed views on the link properties and not on a database property. And so you simply go into the link properties, and it's very easy to do to turn this on, although it does take a bit of time when it is essentially setting this up, because you've originally, by default, got the copy of that site database, that site database data on both your parent and your child databases. And therefore, you have to essentially clean it out and relink it and make it so that it's only a single sourced amount, a single source data in one of the databases. And you can do this very simply with little check boxes. That's it. I make it very simple for you to do this, and so that you are reminded of those stringent requirements for this double hop issue. When you click on the box, when you click on any one of the boxes, you're going to get a little pop-up that says, hey, you can only have one provider at the particular syndrome administration site, and you can only have one SRS, and it has to be configured thusly. It is fully documented in the online documentation for SP1, but needed to make sure you understand these situations. And SQL Server, as an example, is cluster is not supported. So these things are listed for you, and I actually make you have to look at that dialog box every single time you click a button, because it's very important that you know it and you don't forget it. And it is annoying, and unfortunately I wanted it to be annoying, so I didn't put you in a spot to where you forgot, because you may click one and then come back and click another in a later date. All right, that's it. That's how you set up distributed views if you want to stop replicating data for hardware inventory, software inventory, and status messages. Now, what is next? Now what's next is scheduling site data. So instead of stopping the replication of this data, you can actually schedule the replication of the data, much like you've seen before in scheduling the data for your distribution point content. We use the same control, and you'll see that when I give you a quick demonstration of this. But I need you to be aware of the situation here. This is mutually exclusive. And the mutual exclusiveness of this is if you're putting distributed views on for hardware inventory, you can also schedule it, because obviously you've already turned off replication for it. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. I shouldn't have closed that dialog box so that it would have come up very quickly, but I can easily click on the ribbon here to pull up the dialog box. If you go to the scheduling, you're very familiar with how to schedule content replication. This is how you schedule site data. And again, all you have to do here is do all site data, or you can individually select which pieces of data that you want to schedule. Close it again. I'm going to go ahead and click that back so it comes up. All right, let's go on to our next one, the link status itself. This is one I alluded to in the presentation yesterday in regard to not getting alerts for replication links that you might know are flaky or take longer because of latency purposes or bandwidth issues, and therefore you don't want to have alerts showing up in your console and your operations people calling you in the middle of the night. And additionally to this, you need to know that we've made some improvements here so that when you get a degraded status on your link, it is not specifically a bad thing. All it means is You know, I've had a patch Tuesday, I've got a lot of data that I need to replicate, and I may have a slower link or a lower bandwidth link or whatever, and it's all queued up. Degraded just means I'm not getting it done within the amount of time that you've asked me to get it done. That's all degraded means at this point. It means they're still talking to each other, but I'm still trying to get the data replicated across the link. So what does that look like? Go to the Alerts tab, and once you get to the Alerts tab, you essentially configure the alerts in these dialogues here. You also have the ability to say, when I'm at the failed, how long can I stay at the failed alert failed status, before I send an actual alert that says, hey, red flags, links down, contact the troops and get them to come fix the links. This is what that is there for. Now, you might not understand this totally because we couldn't come up with an exact formula for your replication links to be able to send these when you go to degraded status and when you go to failed status, because we replicate different kinds of data at different intervals. So some of the data replicates every minute. Others of the data, less important, replicates at maybe a 5-minute interval. But because of the improvements we've made, you're able to go to the monitoring node and check on those intervals for yourselves so you can kind of get a feel for the information how quickly it's replicated. So I've added a couple of new tabs here for you to look more detailed into the black box. Let's just look at the replication detail itself first. And inside the replication detail, you'll see these synchronization intervals here. And so an interval could be 1 minute and an interval could be 5 minutes. And when you set your alerts up, you set it up on a per interval basis. And you can see here what types of data, whether it's global data, whether it's site data, and in some cases I don't have it here, site proxy data, which is what goes down to the secondary sites itself. But you can very quickly see the synchronization, how often it happens, and then you can make some detailed decisions on, are things really working well? When was the last time the child sent? When was the last time the parent sent? You don't have to go into the SQL server and run SQL queries anymore. We show that information to you. I wanted to show you an additional piece of information for those that are setting up central administration sites and also for the secondary sites. We now give you the ability to understand what stage initialization is occurring. Have we sent the data, bulk data copy across the network? Are we starting to stuff the information into the database and so forth? You can see here for all of the pieces of data what state it's in before you finally get to that gold level of replication, active and fully functioning. And you can see what might be stuck, where it's stuck, right from the in-console monitoring piece. But because I didn't want you to have to pop around back between the administration Wonderbar and the monitoring Wonderbar, if you are in fact trying to set up your link alerts, I went ahead and did it, but now let's go back to monitoring. I meant to click the initialization or replication detail tab. So you can look directly at the synchronization intervals in minutes, and you've still got these properties here. So you can manage it at either location. So there you just open the link properties again for this particular link that's highlighted here, and then you can set your alerts as you deem necessary. All right? So that's giving you more flexibility. You don't have to take on what Microsoft says it should be. You can define it for yourself and for your appropriate networks. So, because I've got a small little network here of 2 little boxes, I decided to go in and show you some replication traffic reports that we've added for you to look at. Let's see, let's go ahead. This tells you how much data is going across your network now and over a period of time. We keep the data by default in the database for 90 days. We summarize the data. We send the summary of that data as global data so it's available everywhere. And that data is tracking all the pieces of information that is replicated between your individual sites. And because I wanted to show you some more detailed information, this is available. What I've made available here are some screenshots from our internal MSIT database, so you can see what it looks like and a lot more data going across the network. What this gives you the ability to do is talk to your network ops teams with true numbers, and you can be confident of what you're talking to them about because we've made this available to you. Now, certainly we come with a set of traffic reporting, but you're able to create traffic reports of your own. But what we've given you the ability to do is set how often and how granular you want to summarize that data. Do you want to summarize the data over an hour, over a day, or even into like every 15 minutes, which is the minimum that we allow you to configure that. And that configuration is done again in the properties sheets that we've given you on how often you want the replication data to be summarized. We default that at 15 minutes. I don't see a huge reason for you need to change it, but you're able to change that. It's not a huge drain on SQL CPU or anything like that, but we do give you the ability to make those decisions on your own. So what do the pretty reports look like? So out of the box, we give you 10 reports that you can use to understand what the, can you read that? It's a little bit hard to read there, but you can go ahead and look at what reports are available to you. You can look at the types of data that's going across the network. Now, here's what a pretty large network of hierarchy looks like, and that's our internal MSIT network. And I took these snapshots. But so you can see here, you see source site and target site. So you see one way and the other way, so you can know what's going up and what's going down. We give you an average of the data. You can see there very quickly the total amount of data that's transferred over the period of time that you've selected in your reporting, and giving you the quick data. So you can also drill into this to get a little more detail. These reports allow you to click on the individual links and do more detail on the links, so you can just kind of click into it, kind of like hyperlinks, to get the reporting information as you deem necessary. Again, to show you a little more prettiness, if you will, we've given you a pie chart breakout of what it looks like for individual site links and the replication data, and again, how much data is being sent from the source to the target site. Now, real quickly, Replication Link Analyzer, a tool to help you. Who's used Replication Link Analyzer in the past? Okay, a few more people. And I've heard mixed reports on Replication Link Analyzer, and I hope you've had good success with it, because the majority of the reports I've heard is it's helped them fix their links when they are having problems. But I have heard some say that it doesn't fix everything and they still need help, maybe from CSS in some cases, or from their SQL DBAs or their network folks. You may always need help from your network folks when there are problems, of course. But in this case, the improvements that we have made were additional rules to help target and pinpoint more problems that we've seen. So we've been listening to you guys that have had problems, and we've been adding additional rules to help detect what replication problems that might occur and put them in the Replication Link Analyzer. And also, we've given you, we've done some UI improvements to help with screen real estate and give you more information on what we're actually doing. For instance, when there is a problem with a particular replication group, I showed you that list on replication detail where there might be just one group that has a problem and not the whole set of data during replication. Replication Link Analyzer will detect that, and when there is replication stuck for a particular group, if that is the case, then then Replication Link Analyzer will simply reinitialize the one group instead of the entire data set that you have in your database, obviously helping improve the efficiency of the data and getting it, the data replication across your network and getting it fixed quickly. I'm not going to show you a demo of this because it's kind of, boring if you've used it before. It just is a point and click. If you ever used Network Troubleshooter before, for those that haven't used Replication Link Analyzer, the only thing that I wanted to point out, I don't have a screenshot here, is the fact that when you're in the monitoring page, the Replication Link Analyzer is very easy to start. You select the link and you click the button. And then that's just like when you go down to your network and you right click on your network and you say troubleshoot problems. It's a very similar model that we're using to troubleshoot your link problems. Now, it looks like I went ahead and clicked it after all. All right, I'm going to go back to the presentation. So one of the things that has happened is we heard from you guys that the administrator that's running the Replication Link Analyzer doesn't necessarily have the right credentials by default on all of the servers. So we prompt for credentials when it's talking to some of the servers that it's checking against, because it checks against the parent, the child, site, primary and CAS, and it checks between kind of a crisscross between the SQL servers and all of that. And they may not have those defaulted credentials, so you can type them in when it's doing those checks. Finally, heard a lot of feedback on what's going on with secondary sites. What happens if my secondary site falls off into the ocean? Okay, I have personally experienced, now I say that as kind of a joke, falling off into the ocean, but it's not a true joke, because I personally experienced 3 major instances where systems have been lost. We've all heard about the tsunami in Japan. We've all heard about hurricanes. Certainly I've had a data center go bad not me personally, but customers have had data centers go bad full of water with hurricanes in Charlotte as an example. Also had data centers in the Midwest that were taken out of business because of tornadoes that hit. And so you may lose a secondary site server, and you may want to say, I've got all of this content dependent, these DPs pointing to the secondary site server, and you're wanting me to re-push all that content down again? Well, the answer is yes and no. So a more common failure would be not necessarily those dramatic problems that happen with natural disasters, but you might have a hard drive go bad or a CPU board go bad or something like that, and you have to fix it and reload it and so forth. CPU board not so much, but the hard drive issues could cause the issues where you have to reload the secondary site. And therefore, it's a very easy point-and-click operation. There's certainly requirements that are around this, that you have to put all the prereqs on there. Now, one thing I'm going to have to say, there's a note at the end here that says, be sure to load the version of the SQL database that was there beforehand. In most cases, it's going to be SQL Express that we pushed out originally. You might ask, why don't you do it again? Well, my bad. We didn't take the state of whether we pushed out the SQL Server database or not and recorded it in the database. That's because you're able, obviously, to use your own SQL Server that's pre-installed or have us push out a SQL Server. So in this case, you have to install the SQL Server again for that secondary site server. But the good news is, if in fact your content library existed on a secondary drive, but where the secondary site server was installed, the bits on maybe your primary disk went bad, but the content library is still in good shape, we detect that. And you don't have to re-push content back out to that secondary site. Additionally, when we do the rebuild of that secondary site server, we re-init with the existing data that already existed for that secondary site server, so it really retains its original properties. It looks like the secondary site server that existed there before when you do the secondary site recovery. Now, how do you do the secondary site recovery? Very simple. Again, I showed you the quick button that you would push for replication link analyzer. If you go back over into administration, I'm not going to have it. It might be grayed out here because I don't have a secondary site. If we go back into sites, you're going to have the ability to recover a secondary site right there. It's grayed out for me because I don't have a secondary site in this particular demo box, but you simply click it, and it's pretty much like installing a new secondary site, with the exception of we keep the data and its identity around and just push that back down. So it's pretty simple, but it has a lot of power for you because all that content doesn't have to be redistributed. Obviously, if you've lost the content on the secondary site server because of a natural disaster or an issue with the drive that contained the content library, you do have to get the content there somehow. And you can do that with the pre-staged media or pushing it down as necessary. But those options are available to you to get recover the secondary site server. So does that help with a lot of issues that people had with the original RTM? Yeah, I'm thinking so. Okay, so that we heard that loud and clear. So finally, just wrapping up here, as part of this conversation, I want to reiterate the fact that we heard from each one of you about many improvements that we could add in the server infrastructure and the server capabilities to help you out. And I hope you see through our presentation today that we in fact have addressed a majority or a large portion of the questions and requests that you have made to us. And this is this is essentially the end of the presentation, but we want to answer some questions now, especially in a room this size. I need you to go to the microphones, and if you could raise the lights so we can go ahead and start answering questions here, we can answer any questions that you may have. Yes?
With the poll distribution points, can you pick which distribution point you want it to come? So if there's a whole bunch of distribution points on EMA, geographical region, have them pull from each other versus going across the pond?
So you do take a pull distribution point, and you do tell it which distribution point to pull from.
Yeah.
And so it's well understood for pull distribution points. We take the data, the macro data, to say what content you need, and we do actually push down that data to the distribution point, but then it's up to that pull distribution point to contact ADP and pull it all down. And so in that regard, it acts just like a client, but it essentially offloads all that processing load from the primary site to have to push it to all the distribution points, and it allows a distribution point to handle that.
And the model that we see there is that you could have a bunch of DPs that would only be used as source distribution points for pull DPs. So you would not have, you basically protect them so that no client would actually go to them for content in and of itself. They would basically just be the way to get content to the pull DPs. I'm sorry?
Could you we can't hear.
What is the pull interval?
See it again?
What is the interval at which it pulls at?
The pulling interval, I don't know what the default pulling interval is. you'd have to look in the console to see what the polling interval is, and it may be, unfortunately, I'm not the expert on the full DP, but it may be configurable, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have a similar recovery solution for primary sites like you did with secondaries?
Oh, absolutely. So, well, when I say absolutely, it's not the same as secondary by any stretch of the imagination, but you simply do a recovery of a site server and you point it to either a backup that you've already taken or you point it to another, its parent or child, as whatever the case may be, to get a copy of the data.
In essence, what's happening is the same as what you see on a recovery. I mean, you basically reinstall the bits and then you sync to the parent.
Since a site is a site is a site, all the data is the same across, and it just has to pull the appropriate data for it when it does the restore. Now, we absolutely recommend backing up your SQL Server data. Okay, the pulling and pointing to a source site server will work, and we test it continuously, and it is fully supported, but we really recommend backing up your SQL servers.
So you could point to the CAS database to restore the SQL data for the primary?
Sure.
Wait, did you just say, let me make sure I have that question correctly. Are you saying during the recovery of the primary, you would point to, you said the CAS database, we said to point to the CAS.
Yeah, you point to the CAS.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to take a CAS database and use that to restore a primary per se. Although there is a way to restore without having a database at all and using the reference CAS to fill in all
So for the
blanks.
SQL backup, I hear that there's a new feature that you don't have to use the maintenance task for a SQL backup of a site, that you could do a typical...
So we have multiple ways to do backups, and certainly you can use the VSS that we have built in for the support of backing up your site. However, you can use a straight SQL Server backup task and not use the Configuration Manager backup
What are
task.
the pros and cons of those two methods?
Because I remember when we were speccing this out originally. So the idea behind what we've done is we've taken all those file-based artifacts like site control file and some of the registry keys used to hold identifiers, all that is now in the database. So for the actual recovery, all you need is the database. The idea behind using the VSS task is A, to give you an opportunity to have something built in to do the backup for you without having to worry about a separate SQL maintenance if you wanted to. And additionally, we are gathering things like the logs and some registry entries so that forensically, if you want to look into what was going on the server at the time an issue occurred, you have that data available to you for that investigation.
So essentially, you've got a whole load of options, right? You can do normal backup of the site server to get the files that are on the site server and restore that as you want from a forensic perspective. You can use the built-in backups to do the backup of the SQL Server and the local files on the system, or you can not worry about that and just back up the SQL Server itself. And finally, we support Data Protection Manager. And so now, using the same VSS provider, you can use Data Protection Manager to do this across your entire enterprise.
Thank you.
Certainly.
You had a question first.
Question over here?
Yeah, regarding pool distribution points. Can you actually pull from a cloud distribution point?
I didn't hear what you said. Sorry.
Let me see if I caught it. I think the question you asked is can you set up a pull DP to pull from a cloud DP as your source?
Exactly.
And I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah, no. The answer is no. I can say that only by inference, because we don't have all the content in the cloud distribution point, because the cloud distribution point is there just for the applications that you push out, but all of the patches and all of that type of stuff actually still reside on Microsoft's Remove. So you would have to pull from an internal distribution point to get an accurate list of all of the data that you expect on a distribution point.
Okay.
There was a follow-up with that question there. So there's no failover feature to go from an existing, say, branch distribution point to a cloud distribution point? Well, the main reason with a branch distribution point is localizing the access without any speed issue for the client. So, but say if we have to have a disaster on the local site, is there a way to fail over up? And from what I heard, no, you can't do that. So
there's
can you comment on that?
There are a whole lot of pieces of configuration that are required to make sure that your client would actually ever pull data from a cloud distribution point, and that really has to make sure, and that's listed clearly in the documentation. And the details escape me right now, so I can't give you the exact details, but what essentially happens at the very end of the list of requirements for configuration is that is going to be the last place that data is pulled is the cloud distribution point, but you have to make specific allowances and configurations and you're telling it where to go to get data. So I know I didn't answer you exactly or completely because you're going to have to look at the documentation for all those pieces of information, but it is the last resort, if you will, of where the clients actually will pull data from.
Okay, thanks.
Question over here.
In a geographically dispersed environment, say PAC, Europe and US, what kind of things do I need to think of as far as primary sites? Should they be located centrally like at a headquarter and people reach back in, or should I geographically disperse the primary sites?
So the ideal scenario that we designed against was to have all the primary sites sitting inside the same data center, so that way they could speak very quickly to themselves if you did have additional primary sites. And the idea then is to use site roles to put the actual kind of contact points of the clients in proximity to those clients. One thing to think about in that case, if you're already putting lots of primary sites in a CAS all in the same data center, is to also figure out if you actually need to, to have that. Because once again, geographically dispersed doesn't really help with having multiple primary sites. They don't help you with moving that content around. If anything, you need to have very fast links between the CAS and those primary sites. So you may not even need to worry about having lots of sites. You could just have like a standalone primary and perhaps just put multiple site roles in proximity to the clients to be managed.
And so for the reasons that you might need multiple primary sites, mainly you break that 100,000 clients mark, and you have specific governmental requirements to keep content within a geo region, then you would put that primary site out there. But for all of the improvements that we've made on the roles, like the MPs and the DPs and so forth, you could keep the primary site if those, aside from those regulations, and closely connected in the same data center, and still have the throttling and scheduling out to a distribution point in your geo region, and then, or a secondary site if you're going to fan out content, and you can route content through your secondary sites. But the DPs now with Pull DP can just pull straight from there, and the secondary site helps it pull as well. Helps fan it out to the appropriate locations. But what I think you heard was network connectivity is the recommendation. Make sure you've got good network connectivity between your CAS and your primary.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? One more here.
Any licensing differences between the new full DP you mentioned or just regular DP? Is that the same thing we're talking about here, or?
Okay, do you see my hands tied behind my back? I can't talk about licensing because we're just not the licensing people. You really need to talk to your Microsoft representative to get full licensing information.
But the new term, is that called full DP now, or is it just regular DP?
The Pull DP?
The Pull DP is a DP, just a
Just a
regular
regular
DP. Yeah,
DP
it's just
as
another
before.
type of DP.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, I have a question about OSD at branch office locations. I have a single primary site, and I have about 50 branch offices dispersed around the country. And, for patch management, I'm leveraging the branch cache on 2008 R2. Now, for OSD and the Pixie roll and whatnot, what is the proper thing to set up at the branch office?
I honestly didn't hear what you said. I
This
heard
thing
bits and
on?
pieces.
No.
Yeah, it is, but
I'm
it
not
points
close
to
enough.
you and not to me, unfortunately.
I'll just sum it up. I want to set up OSD at branch locations.
OSD and branch locations,
Yes.
we need to get you in contact with our OSD guy to
Okay.
get more detailed information.
Okay.
And I think I need to wrap up for the next people coming in, so we can answer questions down here on the floor as necessary. Thank you again for attending. I appreciate it.